With the Taliban takeover, the de facto government have made a number of somewhat surprising announcements. The most surprising has been that they would ban the sale, cultivation, and trafficking of opium. Now, as an insurgency, this yielded the Taliban enormous revenues. Whether they mean to actually ban the sale of opium and the cultivation of opium remains to be seen. In the 1990s, they announced a ban, but they didn't really. They still allowed some degree of the trade to continue going because farmers, traffickers desperately needed the revenue. I suspect we'll see that again. When it comes to other aspects of the illicit economy, whether it's the sale and transport of weapons, whether it's cross-border trade, we see the Taliban doing a number of things that look like they're trying to gain control over these aspects, but it really remains to be seen whether or not they genuinely mean to control these things or whether or not they mean to exert control over the actors who are doing these things and to continue profiting from them as they did in an insurgency. And the only answer is that time will tell. So as an insurgency, the Taliban had established an incredibly sophisticated and highly lucrative taxation system. They taxed everything from opium to the cultivation of wheat to anything crossing borders, from smuggled cigarettes to perfume to electronics. And they were even more effective at taxing ordinary Afghans and the transit of goods and revenues than the Republic. And what we've seen since the Taliban came to power is a real focus on this taxation, trying to merge their old insurgent taxation system with that of the Republic, because they desperately need the revenue. They've seen Mullah Baradar, who was the deputy of the movement while it was an insurgency, an incredibly powerful figure, has been tasked with, bringing in the money. And so when we've seen their projections, when we've seen what they've reported publicly about how much tax they've been able to generate, when we see World Bank estimates, they're not doing too badly. For an economy in collapse, for a government that is so ill-equipped to handle the responsibilities of governance, this is one area where they seem to be doing relatively okay. The problem is what they have to tax, the economic activity, has contracted with the economic collapse quite remarkably. So this is one area where I guess if we can say there's hope, if we can say that there's something that the Taliban does well, it is extracting taxes. If the international community wanted to give itself the best chance of dealing with, illicit financial concerns in Afghanistan, counterterrorism, all these kinds of things, the answer would not be the current policy. The answer would be to deal with the Taliban, to establish dialogue on these issues, to really engage, to have a sophisticated, multi-pronged strategy to encourage the Taliban, to encourage businessmen inside the country and outside dealing with Afghanistan, to pressure the Taliban into whatever measures would help address these concerns. We're seeing the opposite of that. We're seeing a policy of excluding the Taliban, of not talking to them, of not taking them seriously, of fear as well in terms of dealing with the sanctions regime in a responsible way, which would be to kind of put the humanitarian concerns front and center, and really find a way to inject liquidity into the country so ordinary Afghans don't suffer and don't starve, in fact. But what we're seeing is a really irresponsible kind of knee-jerk reaction where the international community seems to believe that sanctions or the current sanctions regime is the answer. If anything, the current sanctions regime will drive the Taliban into a place of exclusion. And when they're excluded from the international community, when they have no other options, the only allies they'll find are the ones we least want them to have. In the 1990s, that looked like Al-Qaeda, right? I mean, we've seen this movie before. So I think the international community has to really look at things pragmatically. What can they do to work with the Taliban government on these concerns? Even if the Taliban government is a concern themselves, now is time to think differently because it's clear that the current sanctions in place simply aren't working.